Good evening and welcome to Ask the Experts 2020 Election Edition. My name is Samantha Pelham and I'm a media relations specialist here at Ohio University who works extensively with our faculty members, amplifying their expertise in the media and on platforms such as this. So this evening we're going to be speaking with Geoffrey Dabelko, an environmental studies professor in the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs, Dina Lopez, a geological sciences professor in the College of Arts and Sciences, and Dan Skinner, a health policy professor in the Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine. So thank you for taking your time out tonight to talk with me. It's extremely appreciated, and I'm really excited to hear all of your thoughts on tonight's topic of climate change and healthcare and how they intertwine. I think it's going to be extremely informative, not just for myself, but for all of our viewers. So like I said, to those watching tonight, we are going to be talking on two subjects that have been brought up quite a bit in this election: climate change and healthcare. And specifically, we're going to look at how they're intertwined, as well as how they're reflected in the candidates' policies. So first off, I'd like you to all introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your area of expertise. So Jeff, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thanks so much, Samantha. I appreciate the opportunity. Geoff Dabelko, as you said, a professor in the Voinovich School, trained as a political scientist. Townie actually grew up here in Athens, Ohio, but has spent the last couple decades out in Washington, D.C. and the policy interface, where I spent time there and continue to at Ohio University, trying to understand the links between environment and climate change on the one hand, and foreign policy and even security policy on the other hand. So international environmental issues that often intersect with health and go hand in hand. And so that's been the focus of my research and applied work in the international and Washington policy context.
Great, thank you. Dina, if you want to go ahead and give us a little bit of your background, that'd be great.
Okay, I am Dina Lopez. I have been a professor in the Department of Geological Sciences for more than 25 years already. And my areas of research have been mainly, environmental problems like arsenic, acid mine drainage here in Ohio, which is a very important problem in the abandoned coal mines of the region. I work in some other issues like hydrothermal systems, and other problems, especially in Central America, but also in Spain, in Colombia. I have worked in many different parts, and I have been, I know firsthand what is the situation of environmental issues in all these countries and how they compare, for example, with the problems here in the United States.
Great. Yeah, it's certainly relevant right now as well. So I'm very excited to hear from both of you. And certainly last but not least, Dan, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me again here, Sam. And Dan Skinner, I'm a political scientist by training, just like Jeff is, and although slightly different kinds of training within political science. I'm now a health policy professor at the Osteopathic College here at Ohio University. I also co-direct the Osteopathic Professions Health Policy Fellowship. So I spend a lot of time talking with physicians about how to engage the policy and political aspects of healthcare, which physicians tried to avoid for many decades, but now they realize that it's very important in 2020.
Great. Well, thank you all so much again for being here, for providing some insight into your backgrounds, and preemptively for talking and joining in on this conversation tonight. But before we get started, I do want to remind you as our viewers that if you have any questions about climate change and healthcare, the way that they're intertwined, that you would like to ask our experts, please feel free to message our social media accounts with your questions at any point during this live stream. Any questions that we don't get to tonight, or any follow-up questions that you have, also feel free to comment and message, and we will be sure to ask the experts after the live stream and get you those answers. So, well, without further ado, let's get started with our conversation. So this first question, I think, is applicable to all of you, perhaps maybe in different ways. So the question is, where does climate change stand in the pecking order of voters' priorities? We are less than a month away. So how relevant is this to most voters, and how much do they care about it? Dan, if you want to go ahead and start off the conversation, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a obviously very important question, and we are in very unprecedented political times. So it's also quite challenging to measure things like this. COVID-19 is obviously number one on every list of priorities that we have from a polling perspective, and healthcare is usually right up there with it. And of course, COVID-19 is a health issue as well, so you can't really disentangle them. Climate change has been very high on the list, in top 3 for most Democrats, not as high for Republicans, and we can talk about the kind of different approaches that the partisan divide tends to take on this issue. Really quite high, but also right now we are at a time where most voters seem to be coming at this election from a kind of emergency perspective of things that need to be addressed right away. And I think the challenge for people who really understand climate change and understand the stakes is to keep that on that map, to make people understand that it is an emergency right now, that it can't be, knocked down the list too far.
Great. Yeah, I completely understand. I feel like, this year in particular, and especially in previous years, we've had several fires just escape throughout, the Western United States, and that's just here in our own country. Needless to say, the amount of other, natural disasters and things that have been affected by climate change. Jeff or Dina, do you have anything you'd like to comment on in regards to that as well?
Okay, I can go ahead. This is an issue that it is extremely important for the majority of voters here in the United States. It is estimated that about 68% of the population wants to, do something about, the issue of global warming. However, as we know, there is not really, and the two parties have completely different positions in terms of that, However, we are observing and experiencing big changes in our climate right now. Climate change is threatening not only people living near the coastal areas, but practically everybody. This includes issues as catastrophic events, as hurricanes, and wildfires, as we know well, droughts and flooding that affect the food supply, and also illnesses that can propagate, to unexpected regions, such as those spread by mosquitoes, However, not only the US, but the rest of the world is doing too little, really, to try to stop or decrease the increasing emissions of carbon dioxide that are producing the global warming. Right now, just the past year, the main emitter was China with 28% of the emissions worldwide. We also have the US with 15% and India with 70%. Only these 3 countries are emitting the 50% of the world emissions of carbon dioxide, which is really alarming, However, you consider the last 270 years, and we look at the accumulated carbon dioxide emissions, the United States has emitted 34% of the total emissions in the world. So China has emitted about half of the emissions of the United States in this period of time. So, so we share then a lot of responsibility in this issue. And, we should be doing something about it because it's going to be too late if we wait. Nature doesn't wait. Nature will follow the laws, natural laws, and then we are going to face the consequences sooner or later. So, we don't see really, big changes right now in the sense of stopping these emissions. We hope that, the new administration will do something more about it.
Yeah. I would just add to those 2 excellent interventions and say that in part to suggest that it might be different this time with climate change staying at the top of the priority, despite the fact that we are experiencing an economic downturn that's obviously associated with COVID. Often, historically, there's been an inverse relationship. When the economy's better, then folks feel that level of comfort around their economic futures and can then also prioritize environmental issues or climate change issues. I think for exactly some of the challenges around forest fires, the really bad hurricane season that we're experiencing, where our communities in the southern United States are just getting hit and hit and hit, that is really making this issue stay at the top despite that poor economic condition. I'd also point to what's different in terms of how energized our youth are on this issue in ways that is, I think, different than has been in the past. That's been muted to some degree by the changes with COVID, but there's been lots of continued attention, and particularly then talking about the intersection of these kind of twin crises and the fact that we can't just take them one at a time as they come. The climate crisis, the COVID crisis, the economic crisis are all intertwined and require that we, walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of taking these things on.
Yeah, that's a good point you make too about, people worried about, their economic standing and what's going on in the economy. It's definitely something I would have never personally thought about. So yeah, that's a really great point that you bring up here. And I think something so extremely relevant and, on people's minds right now that, walking and chewing gum at the same time, you do need to think about all these different issues and not just one of them. Kind of going back though, Dina, to what you were talking about before on the carbon dioxide emissions, can you explain a little bit about why it's important for the United States to have a plan of action to reduce those emissions?
Well, again, we are facing the consequences already of doing nothing, and if we consider that according to the people that are doing research in this matter, if we continue the emissions as we are with the same trend, with the same, increasing trend of emissions of CO2, we are going to have an increase in temperature of more than 4 Celsius degrees. That's about 8 Fahrenheit, during until the end of the century. So at that point, the catastrophic consequences, we will have to face it. And here is not a matter of the Earth surviving or not. The Earth will survive. It is our problem, humanity survival, which is in the game here. It's not really the Earth. The Earth will survive, and maybe with a different population, maybe with a different species, whatever. But the fact that we probably will be erased from the face of the Earth because of our actions, is something that we need to face. It is true that in the COVID and the CO2 emissions in some way, share one reality, and it is the economic, in between, So remember that, and this is what is going on right now, in global warming and CO2 emissions, as well as in the COVID crisis. The big, decisions are taken either based on the economy or based on the health of the people, And we can say here in the global warming will not be the health of the people, but the health of the environment, And this is the two positions that we are seeing, at the political level, In one side, one party is putting first, the economy, and then in the other party they are putting first, the health, either of the people or the health or the economy, So what is the best decision, and what should be doing? I know that it is a complicated problem. It is not a problem that it is easy to solve. If you look at the platform of the obviously the platform or the Republican Party is more or less well known, but the platform also of the Democratic Party trying to go more into the green jobs and changes to green energy and renewable energy. In other words, that's beautiful. You see it there and you say, okay, this is probably the way that we should go. But how is going to be done? That's the big question. I mean, how is going to be done? Minimizing the impacts and the economy of the people. So it's not an easy thing to decide. And I am afraid that we all will have to put a little bit, of effort and sacrifices, to get to that point. And, it's not only, to have beautiful laws as we have right now, but also the environmental education is crucial. People, and also we need to have a system that, makes people to feel that they are responsible for the future of others, not only, our future, because what we are, what is right now into the discussion is practically, the future of the next generations, not ours. We will be gone in a few years, but what is going to happen to the new generations? That's, the big problem.
Samantha, if I can just add one point to that also,
yes.
Those of us who have tried to talk with others about how important the environmental issues of climate crisis are, sometimes you come up against a wall there, right? We know that we've had some trouble in recent years with the politicization of science, for example, and people's trust in science. I think one of the things that people need to know is, there are a number of ways to talk with people about these issues. People on Wall Street who are doing long-term financial projections and looking at the sustainability of their business models have to take note of this, of these changes. The Pentagon has identified climate change as the biggest threat, long-term, leading, or one of the biggest threats leading to the long-term stability and security of the country. So even if it's not climate change alone, there are so many other areas of social life, even patriotism, the idea that our national security is at risk, can be persuasive. So I encourage people to look at some of those kind of cross-cutting cleavages.
Yeah, Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to add on to that?
Well, I really appreciate Daniel bringing up the security angle. I've spent the last 30 years, that's been my area of focus. So it's I'm always pleased when folks see that as a important and productive dimension. He's absolutely right that this has been a topic of concern, particularly the last 15 years. It is not one that necessarily gets the investment, we'll say, that weapon systems and other more traditional tools of the military. And it's really not to be that they should be the lead at all in responding to it. But what's so powerful about that statement, that the prioritization of that issue, is it should be a spur to the say the Congress, the states, the feds, the private sector, us in the public communities to take really the action that Dr. Lopez outlined that runs across the gamut of our economy, our social structures, where we live, how we move, and how we feed ourselves. And in that sense, the assessments that are so familiar to the security community, which is low and unknown probability and lots of uncertainty, but they're really negative consequences of those actions. We have far more certainty in the climate science than some of the calculations that they have to make, yet we still seem paralyzed, particularly our political institutions, to take those actions that the others have outlined to do it. And so I think whether that's to the faith community, the security community, we're doing some work here locally that also ties into international, where we're focusing on older adults and our experience experts to understand what climate change means for them particularly, but also how they are a persuasive moral voice with literally the experience to help us navigate. They've had some experience navigating the ups and downs, and so getting out of a sense that this climate change discussion is for the climate scientists and some lawyers, and the rest of us don't have to pay attention is just part of the problem. And going to some other audiences that are indicating it's a priority is one of the ways we can do that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I know, the more I think about climate change, you're right. It's not just for those who study climate and scientists. It's for all of us, because it impacts all of us in one way or another. And like you all had said and given examples of the different ways, those on Wall Street, how it affects their stability and whatnot. It is truly a topic and a subject I think we all need to really look more into to understand it, as well as how we can help combat it. So I know, Dina, you had brought up a little bit about, our current candidates' views, how one is presenting it as the economy is a really big priority on his radar and his policies, and the other is looking more into, the healthcare and has talked more on climate change. So can each of you kind of talk a little bit about, President Trump and candidate Biden's, views and policies on climate change and healthcare, and the ways, if they have at all, even talked about the how those two intertwine, and what they will do going forward to combat them, or help us as the United States with them.
I'll jump in just with a quick kind of setting the terms comment. I'd amend your characterization of one focuses on the economy and the other on health and these other issues. I'd say one focuses on the economy to the exclusion of all others, and with a perhaps a false or a narrow, we'll say, sense of what it takes to pursue the economy. So President Trump's agenda is to remove environmental regulations and other what he perceives to be impediments to that economic growth. President Biden's plan, his climate plan, for example, suggests that these are not, it's not a zero-sum game where you can have one or the other, that through, as Dr. Lopez said, the focus on green jobs and making that green energy transition, that's actually central to how we build back better in responding to our multiple crises, and that it is a false choice to say that it's environment or climate versus the economy, that these things are intimately intertwined, and then the details of those programs for each of them and their approaches kind of flow from that basic, very big difference in terms of how they view these things.
Yeah, Vice President Biden has announced kind of clean energy revolution of sorts, that he calls it, and has called for, attaining zero emissions by 2050, I believe it is. Interesting. I mean, he's linked up with a few other narratives in our political life. For example, infrastructure. If you remember, those of you who can remember 2016, one of the great bipartisan hopes of what Democrats hoped they might be able to accomplish with President Trump was, because President Trump, whatever you think about him, he likes to build things, right? That's kind of what how he talks about himself. So there was a lot of hope that infrastructure could come about, a kind of Eisenhowerian, approach to bridges and tunnels and roads. And of course, now we see with COVID, internet. And internet was something that we had talked about a good deal back then. Vice President Biden does talk about addressing the climate change crisis as being wrapped up very closely in the building of new infrastructure, which also somewhat happily, especially at a time of mass unemployment, could be a conversation around employing a lot of people as well, particularly in areas like Ohio, so-called Rust Belt areas where you have former industrial areas that have high levels of unemployment and could presumably be the vanguard for a green revolution. There's this Green New Deal out there that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others talk about. Joe Biden says, well, it's a good framework for thinking about the big issues, but we need to look at some specific policy areas. So, and I'll just point to two other quick pieces, and I'm sure others will have something to say. He links this up to global leadership. President Trump has been mentioned, withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement. So Joe Biden sees a possibility of saying this is an opportunity to regain American leadership on this issue. And finally, to restore some regulatory issues that are not only about climate, but are about racial and racial justice as well. Because we know that the effects of climate change disproportionately affect communities of color. So Joe Biden's trying to put all this together in his platform, which he hopes will draw a contrast with the kind of climate denial that we see coming out of the Trump administration.
Yeah, something that it really worries me is that in the Republican Party, platform for natural resources, for example, they mentioned that we will restore to Congress the authority to the national ambient air quality standards. And they said that they, in a few words, that they are going to forbid the EPA from regulated carbon dioxide emissions, so that because they say that the Clean Air Act never tried to regulate emissions of carbon dioxide. But in all this discussion, we also are forgetting something that is important. It's not only the cycle of carbon that we are altering. For example, the cycle of nitrogen, with the fixation of nitrogen from the atmosphere, to produce, for example, fertilizers and so on, we are taking the same amount from the air that the plants of the planet. So this is a horrible change. Sulfur dioxide, all the emissions of sulfur dioxide because of the burning of fossil fuels, all the emissions of sulfur dioxide or in general sulfur to the atmosphere, because of the mining industry and so on, all the, emissions of nitrogen oxides from the burning of fossil fuels, and in a few words, we are really altering a lot of chemical cycles in the earth. The consequences of that, we don't know it yet. We have concentrated basically in carbon dioxide because it's the first culprit, that we are, looking at the effects already. But what is going to happen to the other cycles, and this is, in reality, a lot of the alterations to the cycles are also coming from the burning of fossil fuels. When we burn fossil fuels, we input sulfur, we input mercury, we input nitrogen oxides to the air. So, we need to think also broadly and think that, we need also to have action in the emissions of carbon dioxide. In that way, we are also helping to ameliorate the problems of the other chemical cycles,
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if any of you have any more to add on to that. But we do.
I will just say one quick framing thing. And because, it's very important to me that we have conversations that are always as fair and even-handed as possible. Well, one of the things, I'll just put my cards on the table, it's very hard to talk about this in a way that doesn't come across as partisan, only because the framing, the setting that Jeff kind of put out there of either believing in the science or not is kind of the entree point into the whole conversation. So I want to put that out there because I think that it's not even there are political reasons why we are at this moment, this precise moment. And I think it needs to be approached just as purely descriptive more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's a good reminder. It's important to distinguish between debating the science and debating the policy response. And in part, the science, there will, as is in the scientific enterprise, there are always going to be more questions, but we have a great deal of certainty about human impacts and how we're dramatically changing this planet. On the policy side, lots of reasonable differences of opinion that sometimes correlate in ways that you'd expect by party and sometimes not at all. That ranges from a whole wide variety of different ways that we tackle it. And so that's where the political debates need to happen on the policy response side as opposed to the science side. And so, as I said, the point of entry is that the kind of objectivity of science is where we need to have our roots and our foundation to go forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really great way of putting it too, in terms for those who, are trying to debate that science versus policy. And, I think the way that you presented that made it extremely clear as to how we should be looking at these things. Dan, I was going to mention before that you had brought up, the Paris Agreement. And so we actually have a question from Facebook about if you, and this is directed, I believe, at all of you, if you can explain what pulling out of that agreement would actually do for not only combating climate change here within the United States, but also throughout the world. So whoever wants to take that away.
My understanding is that this agreement are trying to decrease the emissions of carbon dioxide, and in that way we will try, to decrease the rate at which the temperature of the atmosphere is increasing. That doesn't mean that we will stop it, because probably we are already, at a point where this warming cannot be stopped easily, but at least to decrease, the rate at which it's happening. So, it's important then for all the world, even when, according to, some experts, the measurements that are targeting, for this decrease are really very humble. To say the truth, we probably, could improve, but that doesn't mean that we will solve the problem with those measurements. But again, anything that decreases, those emissions and decreases the increase in temperature of the atmosphere will help.
Yeah, most people I've spoken to about the Paris Agreement, who are true diehard climate activists, find it to be wholly insufficient. Maybe even the absolute least we could have done, which really frames how they understand that political moment, that it wasn't an aggressive approach. It was actually fairly conservative, small c conservative. That's precisely why we have this interesting moment where President Trump sees it as, first of all, it taps very well into a lot of other beliefs that he has put out as part of his kind of presentation, that he doesn't believe the other countries, particularly China, will report correctly, that they'll play fairly. He sees it as disadvantaging America economically and things like this. Whereas, as I mentioned before, Vice President Biden has added it to his platform explicitly under the global leadership umbrella of saying, this is an opportunity for us to, we invented the United Nations practically, right? We could lead these organizations and shape them rather than being a passive or a kind of or victimized by them. So I think that's one of the framings I would encourage people to think about.
So, and the United States have a relatively good history of environmental protection, in the sense, not perfect, obviously, but and the 3 laws that were issued, in the 1970s, with the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the other, related to the conservation of species, have been extremely useful. In fact, if we look at the data for different contaminants, like carbon monoxide, like volatile organic compounds, lead, and so on, we can see a clear decrease from the moment that we started to have those laws in place. So that has helped a lot. And that's really a good point for the United States to have done that. But, again, it is happening in all those different chemicals, but in carbon dioxide, it has been the opposite, We have been increasing the concentrations, but a good thing that we need to point out is that between 1990 and 2018, the emissions of carbon dioxide have been not constant, but the fluctuations have been between 5 and 6,000 quadrillion, whatever the name is, of the unit, of carbon dioxide emissions, or tons of carbon dioxide emissions. So, that's good, that it's a good news that we have not increased too much, in relation to the, to this long period of time. But the bad news is that we have not decreased it. And to really solve the problem, we need to decrease it, not only the value to stay more or less constant,
Right. Yeah. We need change, not to just stay flat on that.
I just want to add too, my colleague Dr. Lopez is talking about the good, just to get a political gut check, right? The good old days of the 1970s and the Nixon administration when the EPA was founded. I mean, when you think about where the different parties were in American history, many of the institutions that are now real declared enemies, or that the Republican Party has distanced itself from, defunded, etc., were actually established during the Nixon years. So I think it's worth studying the history there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I in a similar vein, I think rejoining the Paris Accord is necessary but wholly insufficient for actually making the progress we need to make on climate change. It's necessary for the United States to join that body so it can be in the room rather than in the corridor when the decisions of the governments coming together to make these treaties and tackle these problems are there. It's also because our leaving has left a leadership vacuum that the Chinese have taken up. And in some ways that's very positive. In other ways that, again, leaves us on the sidelines. And also our backing out allows others who would like to back out do so with cover, as opposed to our staying in and them being pressured to stay in. But I think it also points out the again, necessity but limitation of the global agreement where you by definition are getting least common denominators because everybody has to agree. And so it suggests that we can't just depend on that mechanism for tackling climate. It needs to be within states, within countries, and then states within. And so, you know, California's leadership is tremendously important on an international stage. And so we need to look to that level of a kind of political organization. The private sector, incredibly important for doing it. And so these things, the good news is those activities can go on regardless in some ways of what's happening in Washington, D.C. and who's in charge. D.C. can make it a lot harder and a lot slower. But it really is imperative that we rejoin Paris, but kind of rightly understand that that's not going to truly solve the problem because of the Accord's weaknesses and because it's going to take a lot more action by a lot of other actors to really make the progress we need.
However, the United States has been a leader in many different, issues around the world, and I think that we shouldn't be losing the opportunity to really be the leaders in these changes, because probably even the future of the country will depend on that. And they in the same way that they try to make, in the same way that they are trying to, force some other changes around the world, we can also try to force. Maybe force is not the best word, but to try to deal with this problem and lead, to try to change, and I think that in that way to be leader in the renewable energy can lead us to that. I hope that if we have the opportunity that can work, but again, it will require many brains together and be very creative, because those transitions are not going to be, soft. We are going to have, some suffering and some, sacrifices, to get that. But we need to keep clear that that's the way that we want to go in order to preserve the earth for the future generations.
Yeah. I think we're going to spend a lot of money to get out of these economic doldrums. Places like China and the European Union have decided their fiscal stimulus is going to be focused on green investments and green infrastructure, and try to be leaders in the technologies that have been developed and are going to be developed in this space, and see that as an economic opportunity that drives jobs, much like the plan of Vice President Biden, as opposed to investing in old energy sources, old economies, and subsidizing industries that even before questions of how should we have a price on carbon are falling way to more efficient and alternative energy sources strictly on the economics.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for both of those questions, or for both of those statements to those questions. I think, a lot of people still kind of have questions about what it means to not be in the Paris Agreement. I think you both answered, all three of you really answered what it means to be in it. And I think, what you said, Jeff, about being in the room rather in the corridor is extremely important. You know, you need to know what's happening, and necessarily, you know, standing in the corridor just watching at sidelines isn't being proactive. So thank you for your comments on that. This question is more directed towards you, Dan, from kind of the idea that this you know, conversation is about climate change and healthcare and how those two you know, work together. What ways does climate change come up in your area as a health policy professor? And then, is climate change a healthcare issue? And that can be something, you know, all of you can respond to if you'd like as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely so. And, you know, I think that we didn't understand, or we didn't talk about the full scope of this 10 years ago, but increasingly, you know, you can't talk about climate change without talking about a health component. And as I mentioned before, a health disparities component specifically. You know, increasing allergens. Here we are at a time where we have a respiratory and other illness sweeping the world. You know, it's a big concern. Different vectors, malaria, dengue, West Nile virus, as the earth warms, that's going to increase right with it, say the experts. Air pollution, water pollution, you know, malnutrition, where we have droughts. And that's also one piece that has, as we mentioned before, and Jeff is the expert on the national security piece, but when you cause mass environmental destruction in developing countries, that creates conditions that the Pentagon takes very seriously at looking at for threats, the building of potential threats to the country, right? We know that destabilizing nations is something that leads to terrorist activity and to some of those threats. Health-related illness is coming from extreme heat, and you know, and there's a cycle here as well. You know, the need for air conditioning to be able to live through something like that, it can itself then become a vicious cycle that emits further pollutants. So. And I'll just mention you have other aspects, just like forced migration, people who are really talking about immigration. We all know that President Trump got elected on this idea of building a wall and sort of closing borders. Well, one way to force people to move over borders more is to not deal with the climate crisis.
Well, I am originally from El Salvador, Central America. And my country has been very badly hit by, you know, different problems. You know, for example, you know, May is the time where the people plant the crops and so on. But then suddenly you have a drought and the plants never grow. They plant again when they have some rain, you know, and then it comes a flooding event and destroys the crops too. So, you know, we have this cycle of, of floodings and droughts and so on. That is really making the people poorer and poorer. And a lot of the migration that you are seeing now, all these caravans and so on that are coming to the United States, is really people that are coming here, are trying to get here because of desperation, you know, because they don't have a way to live there and they need to find some way to feed their children and so on. So, you know, in reality, to stop this problem or to try to decrease this problem is going to help even in that matter. You know, people do not migrate if they have a good life, and you know, they go because they are trying to look for better places. You know.
Yeah, I think you can also, it's maybe one step removed from these immediate connections that we just outlined, but also look at the potential positive synergies that some responses will help on both the health front as well as the climate front. So, you know, we look at COVID and zoonotic diseases. In part, it's through the deforestation and land use change in particularly some of these areas where we're having wildlife and human interactions in a greater instance, that twin need to stop and slow that deforestation from a climate change perspective, because those forests are sequestering carbon, and the need to reduce the chances of greater incidence of zoonotic diseases, that there really is an alliance in terms of kind of integrating those responses and understanding that there are benefits in both areas from some of that behavior that takes a longer view of the value of those ecosystems and the needed separation and kind of steps that we need to take so that we reduce the possibility of these diseases jumping from animals to humans that are having the obvious devastating effect.
Mm-hmm.
I want to mention as well, while we're talking about the healthcare framing of this, we are increasingly a nation that talks about moving from a so-called sick care paradigm to prevention, right? The college at Ohio University, the medical school, we talk about prevention a lot from a primary care focus. The amount of disease that will be created, the amount of sickness, the amount of preventable illness that we have with climate change has to be part of that conversation when we talk about preventing health, ill health. And increasingly that's becoming part of the conversation. When you look at the amount of costs to the healthcare system that we are facing just from climate change alone, we've been through 8-9 months now of thinking about capacity within our healthcare systems, thinking about the cost. Climate change is a huge layer added right on top of that. So I think that's another area where people can think about climate change in a very nuts and bolts way, just from the cost of healthcare and the unsustainability of our healthcare system as it's currently built.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess, my next question about considering this is what are those next steps that we can take, both immediately and ones for the future. We're talking about flooding occurring that can wipe away and devastate crops that people need to eat, and that like you said is linked back to healthcare. So what can we be doing now to try to stop this? Because for me personally, it feels like something that is such a crucial need right now. People are suffering because of impacts from climate change. Is there anything we can be doing now, or is this more, for the future generations so that they don't have to be impacted like this?
It's tempting to say vote on November 3rd.
I'm not known for being a very optimistic person. I tend to be glass half empty about most things, and lately I've been wondering if there is a glass at all. But I will say on this, as a teacher, I have an obligation to give my students something that gets them excited about what they can contribute. And this is where the possibility of thinking about the economic benefits of green energy, of green projects, has to be something we take seriously. If there are diseases, then we have to get excited about curing them. And if there are economic challenges, then we need to get excited about, solving them. And I think that climate change is the biggest. I mean, Joe Biden calls it an existential threat. Lots of people do. There should be nothing more exciting than being the person who takes a whack at an existential threat. And I think that's kind of what we have to do right now. And there are so many smart people doing great work who have great ideas. They're incredibly frustrated by the policy climate. They're incredibly frustrated by the idea of, of passing bills through Congress. But, they have something new at their side now that they didn't have 10 years ago, and that's public opinion. And I'll tell you, nothing scares politicians like public opinion. So, I to me, that gives me great hope. And it does mean that it gives people ideas for thinking of this as a creative venture, as well as just solving another depressing crisis.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think it's absolutely right. And in addition, we have a greater openness to kind of putting more tools in the toolbox. We talked about how we can't just leave this to the climate scientists and the lawyers, right? It's something for all of us. And so I've been inspired by the students here on campus pulling in entrepreneurship and innovation out of a business school approach and putting it together with practical problems. And so they're pulling in economists and business administration folks, Dina's geology students, and folks who are focused on the healthcare side and policy side. I mean, the students are recognizing the problems we have today cannot be solved by a single discipline. And so they're looking for training and experiences that allow them to put more tools in the toolbox and then apply them together. And that means working in teams, that means applied-based learning and the hands-on learning that so many parts of Ohio University provide for the students, and where the students, faculty, and staff work together to solve these. And so I absolutely agree that's there's something, there are roles to be played by all, and we can't just leave it to the so-called specialists in this topic area.
Yeah. Come to my mind a fact that happens probably 15 or 20 years ago. And it is that, the politics of the United Nations changed from, decreasing emissions to adaptation. And probably Jeff knows more about that, So suddenly people were getting grants and getting, to work more in adaptation than in the issue of decreasing emissions. For me, when I saw that a long time ago, I thought this is a mistake because, it's not that we shouldn't adapt, but we cannot emphasize adaptation against decreasing emissions because it's very dangerous, It takes the idea, okay, we can adapt to anything, and that's not true. Our adaptation is limited. So, and we are now probably 15 or 20 years, I don't remember exactly the time, but it's probably in that range of time. We are now in this situation where we are already facing very bad consequences of the lack of action during all this time. However, we still can do something, but I think that there are measurements that can be taken in a short term and in a long term. I cannot tell you exactly what to do because I think that that's not something that can be answered easily, that we should be putting a force in our brains to work in creative measurements in both directions, to try to solve the problem that we have in the short term and to try to solve the long-term problem, of the global warming and the carbon emissions, I think that the ideas that, are in the Democratic Party platform are really more tending to the long term, than to the short term, measurements. So I think that in that case they should start to think also in what to do now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we actually have another question too from a Facebook user, semi-related to what you all just talked about. They ask, to what extent does health, climate change, and the aging of our world's population intersect? So whoever wants to take that one away, feel free to open the floor for conversation.
Well, I'll say a word about the older adults and the aging population. I mean, I think there are lots of them. One of the reasons that we're bringing together an age-friendly kind of World Health Organization notion of how we make our communities better and more livable for older adults, together with issues of climate resilience and sustainability, is that WHO methodology hasn't typically looked at those environmental issues. And so part of yet they're focused on transportation, infrastructure, health, access, a whole bunch of things that sustainability and climate resilience is engaged with. And so part of our point of departure is that because of climate change, the world of the future is not going to look like the world of the past, and so we need to talk about that. And so Dan talked about heat events and what that is going to mean for populations, the importance of air conditioning and such. I mean, that heat is going to really adversely affect our older adults who are more vulnerable to those heat impacts. And those who can afford air conditioning, that's one thing, it's going to be a cost associated, but those who can't are going to be especially vulnerable. And even our adaptations there, it's a small point, but one of the things that we found In Columbus, there's a giveaway for fans to older adults of less means to deal with heat events. Well, it turns out sitting in front of a fan accelerates your dehydration rate, which is then furthering the vulnerability of the older adults, particularly on certain medications. So part of the messaging then became, here's your fan and here's your water bottle, and you have to really make sure you are hydrating while you're trying to stay cool in these higher temperatures. And so those are the kinds of things on the adaptation side where the future is not going to look like the past and more people are going to have these bigger problems. And so those are things that we need to do. And at the same time, hopefully, by collaborating on infrastructure and housing and transportation, we can also make progress on the mitigation side that also helps this population and to have a more livable community.
Oh, I think you may be muted, Dan.
Dina mentioned how this is often seen as the long-term issue, and that's a political problem sometimes, right? Our politics tends to be very short-term, even to, is the market up today or the market down? That kind of stuff. When really we're playing with much bigger stakes here. But I do think one of the happy parts of this problem we now have, I mentioned creativity before. When you think of aging in place as this thing that is so important, we now know to the health, particularly, Ohio is a state with a population decline, but also an aging population. We have a great example right here in Ohio of these dynamics. Aging in place is very important, but also aging in place has a lot to do with other problems that we resolve, that confront us, that are also healthcare related, like transportation, right? So when you start to think, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges for us politically, is to think systematically and systemically about the connections of pieces. One of the standard lines I use, I teach health policy to medical students here at Ohio University, and one of the standard lines I use, and it's a little, maybe a little hokey, but health policy is not just health policy. Tax policy is health policy. Environmental policy is certainly health policy. Tell me one part of education policy right now that is not also health policy. So I think when we start to think about the connections of these things instead of like little segmented policy domains, then we can start to get creative and we can start to think about our society. But I do think that when we think about our aging population, we think about older folks, not only do we have a lot to learn from them, and those voices don't get amplified nearly enough, but also, in their challenges lie a lot of answers to some of our biggest policy questions.
So, talking about population and sustainability, one thing that probably very few people are researching really is the fact that how we know if we have already passed the carrying capacity of the earth in terms of human, because all these problems are related to that. We are increasing and increasing. We are almost 8 billion people, I think, right now. It's incredible, the way that the population of the earth is increasing, and I don't have answers for that, obviously, but I really would like to see more research oriented to that, but I think that everybody's afraid to do it, and to answer the question.
Great, thank you.
And that's,
okay, go ahead.
That's probably related more locally, because different parts of the world probably have different carrying capacities, so Ohio, thanks to God, seems to be okay so far.
Well, we are unfortunately getting to the end of our conversation, so I have no more questions for the three of you, but I did want to open this conversation up for any last, comments or questions that we didn't get to tonight that you wanted to say something brief on. So the floor is the three of yours to say any last things you would like.
I'll make one comment that has kind of occurred to me. Viewers may know that we had something fairly unprecedented happen in the last few weeks. The New England Journal of Medicine, Scientific American, and more recently Nature have all come out in support of a particular candidate. And I just want to say to that, they did that, they did not do that because they just were so excited to do it. It really is a mark of the moment. And, you know, we always joke about how this is the most important election of our lives, things like that. And, you know, and it seems like every election is the most important election of our life. But I do think that with climate, when we start to think about 4 years and then 4 more years, and we start to look at the data, there's a pretty good argument for this, for every election until we solve this, being the most important. So I have come around to sort of appreciate that narrative, because I don't like overhyping crisis. But I really think that that this is empirically a crisis, and that's why we're seeing some unprecedented things happen.
I'd affiliate myself with that response. Yeah.
Well,
Anything
you know, I think that one thing that we can say is that we need people to vote and vote, you know, because, you know, it's in our hands, you know, the future of the United States, and not only the United States, but probably the world. So, you know, it is important, you know, to go and vote, and not expect other people to change things for you. You know, the changes have to come from everybody.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because in some recent elections there was a notion, particularly held by younger people in our population, that there's very little difference between the two candidates. For in this time of crisis, there are clearly, on these issues we've been discussing today, some very, very big, stark differences. And so if these issues are important to you, then you really do have 2 different alternatives to choose from, and hope you'll take advantage of the right to vote and express your preference.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time and for the conversation tonight. It was extremely informative, not just for myself, but hopefully for all of our viewers as well. You know, I really did learn a lot and took into consideration pieces that I would have never put together, especially like the healthcare and the ways that it's intertwined with climate change, that, you know, I think is really going to make me think about things going forward, and hopefully our audience as well. Thank you all for those who tuned in and for who's watching. If you do have any other questions that you would like our experts to ask, please feel free to message our social media accounts or comment on this video. And that way we will be able to go ahead and get those questions to our wonderful experts, and they will answer them for you. So again, thank you so much for your time. It is much appreciated, and I will echo what they have also echoed, and get out and vote. It is extremely important and something that should not be taken lightly. So again, thank you, and